right, folks. Well, thank you for coming to my breakout on federal administrative research and transactional research. As I just mentioned, I really will be focusing on administrative research probably for about 90% of this lecture. That's just because, we barely cover administrative law research at all in the first year Introduction to Legal Research curriculum. It's obviously extremely important. And so we thought, all things being equal, we should probably focus on that and just talk a bit more about transactional research in the tail end. Again, it's your oral session, so if you have any questions at all as we're going, please feel free to ask. So I will start off with preliminary matters. We'll talk about the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR. I'll discuss research methods for federal regulations, the Federal Register, and then administrative decisions and agency websites, before again finishing off by talking about additional transactional research resources and methods, just in a very general sense. All right, so let's start off with our preliminary matters. So administrative law really is its own thing, right? We have legislative law associated with the legislative branch, right, in the form of statutes. We have cases in terms of judicial law. Then we have our third branch of government, executive branch, which is mostly associated with administrative law. As we'll talk about, we have two main forms of administrative law. They are regulations and decisions. All right, we're going to have that basic three-branch structure at the federal level. So we have the United States Code, legislative, federal cases, judicial, federal regulations, which we'll be focusing on, executive. And then essentially that same structure is mirrored at the 50-state level. So for West Virginia, right, we have legislative law in the form of the West Virginia Code. We have West Virginia judicial law in the form of West Virginia cases. And then we have a specific West Virginia administrative code, which is called the West Virginia Code of State Rules. Right, so exact same structure, just West Virginia state law rather than federal. That makes sense. The only outlier is Louisiana, since it has that French heritage, right? And so it's a little bit different. But again, we're focusing on federal. So administrative law is law that's mostly created by agencies like the EPA or the FDA that specialize in particular legal areas. And what's our basic federal administrative structure? We're going to have a broad area of law like labor, tax, environmental, and food. You're going to have very broad departments like the Department of Labor, the Department of the Treasury, and then you're going to have your specific agencies nestled within those departments. So the Department of Labor has the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Bureau of International Labor Affairs. Department of Treasury, of course, has the IRS. Department of Energy has the EPA, but also other agencies like the Energy Information Administration. It really is important to know these civics because, as we'll see, if you're looking for, say, federal administrative decisions, those often aren't on West or Lexus, and so you have to go to government websites to find those. And it could be that they're on a specific agency's website, like the EPA's website, but sometimes the department instead would house something like all of its administrative decisions from its agencies. So whenever I'm doing administrative research, I do it all the time because my scholarly legal area is energy and environmental law. Right, it's a new area of energy law for me or environmental law for me. Right away, I get a feel for what agencies are involved, right, what departments involved, because that could influence where I go for my research. Does that make sense? Civics-wise? So do you all know the role of the legislature in administrative law? Sorry if you don't. That's why we're here today. So the role of the legislature in administrative law, and this is true at the federal level and for all the 50 states, is the legislature is in charge. Legislatures tell agencies what to do, right? And that makes sense because the legislature is, democratically accountable. Legislators get elected. Agencies are appointed. They're non-democratic, right? They're supposed to be the servants of the legislature, right? So it makes sense, again, when you think about it and right in democracy, from a democracy standpoint. So what happens is, legislature set broad agency mandates in what's called enabling legislation or organic legislation sometimes. And then agencies create detailed regulations through rulemaking. So legislators are the generalists, agencies are the specialists, right? And again, that makes sense. The legislature is going to be filled with folks who say it's important for food to be healthy, right? Americans should have, a good healthy diet. But they don't know anything about food, right? Like the technical aspects of how much, how many chemicals can be in food. So then they punt it over to the agencies and say, hey, you have scientific experts, you have technical experts, you figure out all the specific, right? The chemicals in parts per million in different types of food, and you do more specific regs. So oftentimes when you're doing research, you have to find both types of law. You need to find your broad legislative enabling statutes, which say, okay, we're concerned about food, and then you need to find the specific regs, right? Talking about food in your context, you snap all that together in Google Block. So our legislative enabling statutes are going to be in the federal legislative code, right? That's the USC, the United States Code. Our federal administrative code is completely different, right? That's the Code of Federal Regulations. That's the CFR. Two completely different codes, one legislative, one administrative. But your administrative regulations never exist in a vacuum, right? Your CFR federal regulations are always being promulgated in accordance with broader statutes, which set the rules in the first place.
So if the administrative regulations maybe defines a word more clearly than what's in the enabling statute, would you be able to find what the administrative reg has maybe defined in the enabling statute in the USC, or would you have to go to the CFR?
So there are a lot of different ways. So you're asking, like, how do you find both sets of laws?
Yeah, so if like the administration is doing, the reg is doing something that the legislative enabling statute has like
Delineated.
Yeah, like how do you, I guess, is there like a link kind of to the CFR from the USC?
Yes, indeed, or normally, and we'll talk about those. But you can never trust links to do the work for you. You always, if it's important, if you're unfamiliar with the area of law, have to make sure that whatever West and Lexus have linked together are actually accurate. And that's one of the reasons why administrative law is so difficult. It's big, it's complex, so editors and database folks have trouble linking everything together. It's also why secondary sources can be helpful, because they'll lay it out for you, at least to a certain extent. But it's a great question. All right, agency lawmaking. So regulations typically get all the credit for administrative law, but there are really two main types of agency law. One is regulations at the federal level from the CFR, and also adjudicatory decisions. So let's start with regulations. And again, our official administrative code is the CFR. That makes sense, right? It's our official federal administrative code associated with the executive branch, completely different from the official legislative code, right? The United States Code. One's legislative, one's administrative. So the Code of Federal Regulations still exists in print. They do these hilarious editions every year with actual different colors on the book's spines. That's the only type of federal document where they color code it. And our joke is that they ran out of normal colors in like the 70s. So now they pick like the crayon at the back of the box, right? And if you go into our library, you'll still see the most recent ones. But you never use print in practice, right? So the federal government has a website. This is actually a brand new website called GovInfo, and that's its free online repository for federal law from all three branches. So you have cases there, you have statutes there, you have regs there. So this is the regulations page on GovInfo. So it's going to have your annual editions for each year. So this would be like 2018 is the blue, right? 2017 is the pink. You also have the ECFR, and these are unofficial, but they're updated normally within 2 days. And the federal, you have to hand it to the federal government on this one. They do an amazing job with the ECFR because regulations change all the time, which is super important for a practitioner. And if you're using free resources, it's great that they're generally up to date here within a few days. There's another resource you can use that's also free that we'll talk about in a little bit. And that's how you can actually make sure that your regulations are up to date as of today. We'll focus on Western Lexus. So if you're using Westlaw, and there's a few places you could click to find the Code of Federal Regulations. But where's one place you could click to find regs? Even if you have to guess.
Federal materials.
Federal materials, yeah. You could also click regulations and drill down to federal, but I normally do federal materials. And whenever I'm on a new page, right, whether it's on Bloomberg Law, Western Lexus, like a subpage I'm not familiar with, I call this putting on my civics classes. Because I'm like, man, it doesn't matter what resource I'm using. I know law is going to be represented from all three branches of government, legislative, judicial, and executive, so I always look for that. So I call that putting on my civics classes. And then I also say, you know, there's typically going to be secondary sources and current awareness resources or secondary sources, right? So that's the other thing you want to look for. Primary sources are law versus secondary sources. But here in federal materials, we have law broken up by three branches of government, right? Federal case is judicial, our federal legislative code, the USC, and our Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. So here I go into the CFR, and there we have it, right? Our online version of Westlaw. So the Code of Federal Regulations is complex. It has a really intricate organization because these, the whole CFR structure is complex, right? So at the broadest level, you're going to have titles, and then chapters, subchapters, parts, subparts, and sections. It's the most complex federal resource that I've ever worked with. I think it is just the most complex, hands down. Right, so there's a lot to how it's organized. But when you're looking at a specific reg, only part of that organizational structure is going to be there, right? Because we have these 6 levels. But here's a reg, you just see 3 of the levels. Title 21, CFR, Part 30, period, Section 9. So here we have that reg I pulled up on Westlaw. 21 CFR, 130.9. It looks like a statute, but it's not a statute. It is a federal reg, right? It deals with sulfites and standardized food. That's your first clue. That's not a statute, right? Legislature never talks about sulfites. It talks about healthy food. And then if you just start reading the regulation, you can really see the division of labor between the legislature and our administrative agencies that have technical and scientific expertise. Our legislature would never pass a statute with this level of detail, right? It says any standardized food that contains a sulfiting agent or combination of sulfiting agents that is functional and provided for in the applicable standard or that's present in finished food at a detectable level is misbranded, so we're talking about branding here, unless the presence of the sulfiting agent or agents is declared on the label of the food. It says a detectable amount of sulfiting agent is 10 parts per million or more of the sulfite, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is what an agency does. Right, very detailed, granular, scientific, and technical-based regulation. The legislature is like, we want healthy food. Right, FDA, you take care of it. You can also, if you look up, right, in the organizational scheme, see what agencies and what department are implicated in creating this reg. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, is our agency, folded within the Department of Health and Human Services. So if this were a new research area, I'd make a note of that, because I'm assuming that I'll eventually have to look at an agency website, right, for expanded research. Going to your question about, you find your regulation, maybe you want to work your way backwards and find the statutes. So you can do this on Western Lexus. It's much more difficult, like on a free government website like GovInfo. Any idea, when you have a regulation, what you can do to find the enabling legislation? The authority. Fantastic. There's actually multiple ways you could do it. Context analysis and history sometimes has that information. But authority is the easiest and best way. So here's a regulation. If you want to know what statutes were the enabling statutes, here we go. Authority, which means enabling legislation, 21 USC, 321, 336, 341, etc. So here I clicked into 341. And here we see one statute in the enabling legislation. All right, typically you need to find multiple statutes. Note that, right, we're now in legislative law. This is a statute, 21 USC 341. And that we are in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That's our broad legislative statute. And here you see the broad sort of language that you have of the statute, right? It's not parts per million, it's not sulfiding agents. It's whenever in the judgment of the Secretary such action will promote honesty and fair dealing in the interest of consumers, he or she, man, I can't believe it's still just he, shall promulgate regulations fixing and establishing for any food a reasonable definition and standard of identity. We want accurate labels. And again, this is the legislature's division of labor. Hey, we want our labels to be accurate so people know what they're eating. Again, FDA, you figure out sulfites, you figure out mercury, right, and create more specific regs. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. How do you find regulations that are helpful? Again, going to your earlier question. So, this is a big part of my, personal research area. I'm researching federal administrative law almost every day, and it is very difficult. There's not one way you can make sure that you found the regulation or regulations and the statutes and the interpretive cases that you need, because again, very complex, administrative law is rapidly evolving. People who write secondary sources can't keep up with it, or they're not experts in the first place because they know nothing about sulfiding agents, right? So they're not finding the best regs. This is what you have to do. Basically everything in the kitchen sink. You have to use different sorts of research methods to make sure that you found everything that you need. So you can use secondary sources. You can find your federal code that's on point and work backwards from your code to find the regulations that are more specific. You can do a direct search within the CFR, and you often have to leave West or Lexus entirely and go to agency websites. For reasons as we'll discuss, because maybe agency websites are the only place that have adjudicatory decisions, but agencies also issue informal documents like guidance memoranda, right, that almost carry the force of law. They get cited, right, in court briefs and so on. And those often aren't on West or Lexus. And so going to an agency website to find things like guidance documents or policy documents and adjudicatory decisions is a standard part of an expanded research process. I use agency websites all the time because West and Lexus aren't sufficient. So here's the little hypo we'll run through. Your firm represents a food manufacturer that wants to know if and when it must list sulfites on its consumer labels because sulfites, large enough quantities, are dangerous. So let's pretend like we haven't already seen the helpful reg. So if I saw this and wasn't familiar with the reg, I would know right away. I'm like, okay, if we're talking about consumer labels, there has to be agency work. But I also know that agencies have to have enabling legislation. So I'm knowing, at the very least, finding regulations and statutes for this research project. And typically, you're also finding case law, where a court has interpreted both statutes and regulations. And that's your roadblock, right? Statutes, regs, interpretive cases. Sometimes beyond that, you're also citing, again, to guidance documents or administrative agency decisions as well. So with something like administrative law for a broad research project, that implicates all three branches of government, in the very least. It also implicates, a lot of times, like with energy and environmental law, state law. Because with environmental law, for instance, you have cooperative federalism schemes, where you're locating not just federal statutes, cases, and regs, but also then West Virginia's federal statutes, or West Virginia's state statutes, cases, and regs, right? And all of that clicks together. So general secondary sources, especially something like a law review article or an ALR annotation, right, something that provides a lot of detail, can be great ways to find at least some helpful regs. But again, I never trust a secondary source because people aren't good at finding regulations. They have crazy language, like parts per million in sulfites. And so I trust a secondary source to give me statutes and cases. I'm a little bit more skeptical about regs, right? A lot of times, as we'll see here, a secondary source will give you your statutes. You're like, okay, I've at least found my act, my legislative act, and then it's on you to find your regs separately. So here on Westlaw, I went to AmJur, the legal encyclopedia, right? And I searched for food labeling and sulfites. And I did find a helpful on-point entry, misbranding under that legislative act, right, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But it's a short entry. It provides citations to the federal code, but no regulation citations, even though those are really more on point, right? So I think this is a pretty good example of the limitations of secondary sources for regs. So if you found legislative statutes, but you assume that there's more detailed regs, and go to your question, there's functionality on West and Lexus that can maybe lead you to those regulations. I'm mostly using Westlaw, but it's identical on Lexus, right? So rather than searching within the CFR, you would select the United States Code annotated. All right, so we're in the USC. Again, I searched for food labeling sulfites. Here we get our enabling statutes. So again, 21 USC 343, misbranded food within that federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This is a statute that's a few sections later than the one that we were previously looking at. This is unusual, right? When you're doing a big research project, sometimes you have to find, multiple statutes all within an act that are generally helpful, right? You cite to those multiple statutes, like in your rule block, if you're writing a memo. And again, this is the sort of broad language that the legislature passes. A food shall be deemed misbranded if it has a false or misleading label, period. And again, passing off the details to the agency. So remember, if you're looking at a statute, this is a federal statute, and you want to find all of the cases that interpret the statute, that's notes of decisions. That's the case law that interprets your statute. If you want to find the regulations that have been promulgated in accordance with your statute, that's citing references, right? Here's how you get the regs that are promulgated in accordance with your enabling legislation. Note that there's 5,200 citing references, not unusual at the federal level, right? Federal law is very complex, and these also include secondary sources.
Do those notes of decision include administrative law, judge decisions as
No.
well? Okay.
Nope, great question. These are only district court and circuit court decisions.
Okay.
Yep. The ALJ and the administrative board decisions would be another type of citing reference here. Let's see what a citing reference is. Yeah, so here we're looking for regulations. So that's that category. Administrative decisions and guidance would be the administrative adjudicatory decisions. Note that there's 1,000 regs and 1,100 administrative adjudicatory decisions and guidance documents. If this were a West Virginia statute, you would see maybe 3 regs and probably 0 administrative decisions listed. Doesn't mean they don't exist. Federal level, you get thousands. So of course you don't read all of them. What you typically do is you say, all right, I know I'm interested in regulations. However, my supervisor wants me to look for the sulfite regs. So you search within those 1,000 regulations just for the ones that contain the word sulfite, and that's just 6. That's still a lot of regulations that talk about sulfite, right? So again, you can see how complex and large the CFR is. So when we click into the sulfite regs, there we see our intrepid 21 CFR 130.9, sulfites in standardized food. Now, I never trust citing references to give me all or even any of the regulations or adjudicatory decisions that I need. I try it, I see if it's there, I make a note of anything that I find, and then I try all my other ways. Because I'm not going to trust, this is just the machine, right? For citing references, it's machine learning and the algorithm that pulls everything that cites to your statute. Notice of decisions, the actual case law, that's human curated, but again, that's just a sample of long-point cases. I'm not trusting the human editors at Westlaw to get me everything I need. So this is why we call it diversifying your research outcomes, right? To make sure that you have everything you need. Okay. You can also search directly within the CFR, right? So in federal materials, we just go to the CFR. Food labeling and sulfites. There's our sulfites and standardized food. The problem with searching within the CFR is you have to know some key terms to begin with. It's not like searching for a case. It's not even like searching for a statute. You have to know that you're dealing with sulfites, right? Maybe you're dealing with parts per million or some other technical language. So if you have no idea what you're doing and you're not sure what the key terms are, searching within the CFR isn't always the best way to start. Right, I will always start with something like law reviews or ALR annotations and see if someone else has already found what's helpful, and I can at least start learning the keywords.
Do you use the same type of strategy if you're looking for like a notice and comment rulemaking part of the agency, or?
If you're looking at things that are in process and haven't been finalized,
Yes.
I use different strategies.
Okay.
And we'll talk about those. So it's up to you all. So we're at 45. I think I probably can finish in 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Or we can, okay. It's your session. We can also just stop now if you want a break. Okay. Yeah, I've learned a while ago, which I should always check. Some people were like, I want to leave. Defer to that. In fact, that's what we're talking about right now. So, the Federal Register. So, any idea what the Federal Register is?
It publishes daily, and it's basically like what the agencies do, like if they do notice and comment or
Precisely.
what they're up to.
Yep. So, if you've never used it before, I sometimes think of it as the daily administrative law newspaper of the federal government. It's definitely not a real newspaper, right? It's not like the New York Times. It's a federal government document, but it functions like a newspaper. And then it does provide you with updates on what every agency is doing, right? So it's all of the agencies, and it's also all of their actions. So not just notice and comment rulemaking, but also what they've been doing with enforcement, right? And other aspects of agency work. But certainly if you're interested in tracking the notice and comment rulemaking associated with a specific agency, the Federal Register is the official record, both to track what's going on, and you're sometimes asked to do historical research and say, how's this regulation changed over time? What did the notice and comment rulemaking look like back in 1991 when the amendment was first passed? Right, so sometimes it's historical research into notice and comment rulemaking and not just current. So to answer your question now, the Federal Register is one of the best ways to track ongoing proposed legislation. But also, as we were talking about in the other section, folks will set up alerts and use the Federal Register to track what's going on. But that's one of the great things about the current awareness sources, like the BNA law reports. You can also have news people track it for you, right, and write the articles or do the analysis. So you're not just depending on your own research. Federal Register exists in print. Of course, never used in practice. Federal Register has its own federal government website, which is increasingly sophisticated and it works pretty well, right? So here you can see all the updates on what's going on with the agencies, right? How many proposed rules are out there right now. So 13, for instance, right? You can track which agency, of course, has proposed them. So Federal Register, as available on the standalone website, is great. Practitioners use it. It's also on West or Lexus, right? On West, it'd just be Federal Materials and then the Federal Register. It's right beneath the CFR. Lexus is the same thing. I just didn't include that slide. Does that make sense? So the Federal Register is like the official record of what's going on. The website and the register as available on West or Lexus are great ways to track. But people are busy, And if you have a trusted source like a BNA environmental law report, you will see like an article where an expert analyst section is talking about it for you. right, last few minutes are other type of agency law I feel like never gets enough attention, adjudicatory decisions. So this is a case-like decision settling individual disputes that arise under administrative law. So every agency, or almost every agency, is going to have some sort of administrative adjudicatory hierarchy. You have a quasi-trial court level, which is typically administrative law judges or something like that. And then you have one or more appeals levels within your agency, right? Something like an administrative appeals board, right? It's only after you've exhausted your administrative appeals that you can then, in some instances, try to go to federal court. You know, a lot of complex questions about administrative adjudicatory hierarchies, right? Like what, if anything, is precedential as you're working your way up a hierarchy. Sometimes, right, and there's some unanswered questions, and sometimes all of that depends on like the norms of a specific agency, right? Like how often the appeals board will look to its prior precedent. So complex questions there. Research-wise, unfortunately, federal administrative decisions are not available in one place. West and Lexus provide partial access, but it's different access, right? You might find an administrative decision on Westlaw, but not on Lexus, or you might find one that's on Lexus, but not Westlaw. Completely random, right? So you have to check both places. You often, again, have to look to Google, specifically to an agency or department level website to try and find them, like in a repository. With agency decisions, sometimes they're so important. Same thing with like guidance memoranda that aren't on West or Lexus. Then you try Google, or obviously you try West and Lexus first. You try Google, you try the agencies and the departments, and you're not finding it, but you need it. That's when you call the agency and say, hey, I need this, is there, I'm missing it, or is there any way to get it? And sometimes you end up doing a FOIA request because it's so important, right? And maybe they have it on a server, but they haven't posted it online. Maybe they have a paper copy of it, and they're not playing ball and don't want to give it to you. Right, and so depending on the agency, right, depending on how badly you need it, some folks use things like FOIA to try and get like an agency decision that they really need. We call this guerrilla legal research. So, define what Westlaw has. Again, it's federal materials. Then you do federal administrative decisions and guidance. Do a keyword search. Lexus, federal materials. Then federal administrative materials, right, is where the agency decisions are. But again, completely random in my experience, coverage. So I always look both places. And again, if I can't find them there, I'll go to an agency website, I'll figure out what department the agency is, and I'll try the department level. So this is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services website. It just goes to show you, it looks pretty good, it's not a bad website, but it took me forever to find the adjudicatory decisions here. To find them, you go to About.
So you don't go to law and regs?
No, did not work for me. These were these are statutes and regulations. And they had the adjudicatory decisions separated out. So I did About.
That's annoying because that's a courthouse as their link.
Yes.
Like, as their graphic.
In fact, yeah, that's a really good example of how frustrating, this type of guerrilla research is. And then I went into the agencies, but it was within the agencies list that I found the Department Appeals Board listed. Right? So I went in there, and then I found the repository of their board decisions, which I could search by keyword. So here I just searched for, just some general decisions that might be helpful. So I searched for label. I found administrative adjudicatory decision. Right, clicked into it. Oh yeah, this is what it actually looks like. So it is case-like. It's going to read like a case, and it's not like an agency board is only gazette type. Citing to its prior board decisions. That's also going to be citing to things like statutes, regulations, right, federal case law. So it really does read like a case from a normal court, but of course it is an adjudicatory decision, not like a federal court.
Can't those appeal boards also just like make a decision that they're going to defer to the agency head?
I believe so.
And so when that happens, will you have to find that separately? Because wouldn't the agency have to then write a formal opinion as to what they're going to do?
Yes, I feel like I have seen circumstances like that, and like variations on circumstances like that.
So you have to find that somewhere else then?
Precisely. Or there might not even be a record of it. Maybe there's a press release, right? Because maybe they made a phone call, right, at the head level in order to make something happen. So there's no record whatsoever. So yes, in my experience, I've seen at least variations on something like that. Again, agency research, right? So just a minute on transactional research. We talked about it with Bloomberg Law. The idea here really is that it's its own thing, right? So oftentimes you are finding the law, like securities law or tax law, but you're also drafting documents like articles of incorporation, right? Where you have to find model documents, find the law, and so forth. And a lot of informal soft skills like negotiating and advising. So just note that beyond Bloomberg, we do have sub-centers on West and Lexus that are great for transactional law, or that they've developed to sort of catch up to Bloomberg law. On Westlaw, it's called the Practical Law Company. On Lexus, it's called the Lexus Practice Advisor. So to get to Westlaw, actually they didn't create their own transactional law center. They bought a startup and just put it into Westlaw, which is a hilarious solution, I thought. So Westlaw generally can be helpful for transactional research, but to get to the dedicated transactional center, you click at the top and click Practical Law, and then you see the same subject areas that we saw with Bloomberg, right? We see business and transactional areas of law, like labor and employment, corporate mergers and acquisitions, bankruptcy, finance, right? It looks like a little Bloomberg center, because it's precisely what it is. It's called the Practical Law Company. Lexus is called Lexus Practice Advisor, and like Westlaw, you have to toggle out of normal Lexus to get to it. You click the top left on Lexus, you go to the Practice Advisor, and it's just like the Practical Law Company. We see the Bloomberg areas of law, finance, securities, tax. Right, and like Bloomberg, they provide plain English overviews on securities law and tax law. Unlike Bloomberg, they provide model forms, like model articles of incorporation, model clauses, credit awareness, etc. Lastly, RIA Checkpoint is a standalone tax legal research database. Thomson Reuters bought it, right? So it's owned by the same company that owns Westlaw. But it is a standalone, specialized legal research database that just focuses on tax law. It's outstanding for primary research on tax, like finding tax statutes, cases, tax adjudicatory decisions, right, from the tax agencies. And so our tax professors here, Professor Wilson, Professor Bostrom, Professor Bostrom uses tax law as a transactional attorney. This is what they use, right, anytime they're researching tax, because this is much better than the tax that's available on the tax resources that are available on West or Lexus. Although I should add that for those professors, I have a friend who's a tax attorney. You often cobble things together. So when you're researching primary sources like tax statutes, cases, and adjudicatory decisions and regs, you research here on RIA Checkpoint. But if you want a secondary source for tax, if your firm subscribes to it, and this is what my friend does, you go back to Bloomberg, right? And you use the Bloomberg tax portfolios. That's the best secondary source on tax. RIA is the best primary source or law research tool on tax. Right, so use a combination of specialized databases. So any questions? All right, fantastic. Thanks, guys.